Most of us go through life having life experiences, making decisions, even learning lessons, and yet somehow we don't seem to get much wiser along the way. At least that's been true for me in many situations, and I think if you look back on your life, you'll probably find the same thing to be true. So we repeat patterns. We are surprised by the same kinds of outcomes that happen over and over. We tell ourselves, I've learned from this, but then we do it again and again and again. That's not because we're slow or we lack the intelligence. It's because something else important is happening behind the scenes, almost invisible to us. And here's why. At any given moment, you are using an explanation for what's going on. We sometimes call this a mental model. It's a story about what is this situation? What is happening? Most of the time, you don't notice that story that you've been living by or that you've been telling yourself. It just feels obvious to you. And that story is what researchers call a mental model. And learning doesn't usually fail because we lack information. It fails because we never really examine the stories that we're using. And sometimes the story that we're using for a certain situation is not the most effective one to solve the problem, to make the wise decision, to achieve the goal that you have in front of you. So we get these favorite stories that we tell ourselves, these preferred mental models, and we use those stories even when they don't fit the situation. So here's why experience alone often doesn't teach us wisdom. Real life rarely gives us the space, or we take the time to question the stories that we're telling ourselves. So when the stakes are real, our reputation or our relationships or money or other things like that, being wrong can feel really costly. So instead of revising our explanations, we protect them. We defend them, we rationalize, we move on. Experience just keeps happening, but learning is stagnant and we don't get much out of it. We just keep applying our story to situation after situation, and then we add these little elements to our story to explain away why things aren't working the way that we want or the way that we hope. And sometimes those stories can be really destructive. They can even trap us. We get stuck into a story about a story. And instead of facing the facts, instead of really discovering why something is working or not, we just hold on to a story that keeps us trapped. It almost keeps us imprisoned and unable to achieve the kinds of goals that we really want to, or unable to get to the place that we want. Now, here's the thing though. We love our stories. As we develop these mental models and we tell ourselves these different stories, we are really unlikely to just let go of a story and take on a new story. They become almost sacred to us. These stories become really important to us, and we do not want someone else to attack them, and we protect those stories even when reality clashes with them and the story doesn't clearly explain what's going on. How do we work through that? We all have these mental models. We have these stories that we're telling ourselves, and the stories are not helping us make sense of what's actually happening. That's where we get to this next phrase. And what some people talk about in modern language is they talk about it as reframing instead of arguing with ourselves. So the way out of this is not debating or debunking the story, and it's not attacking your own core stories or mental models. It starts with something that's much more gentle. Instead of asking, is this right or is this wrong? We ask a question like, what would happen if I looked at this from a different angle? What might I see that I can't see from this particular seat? So stories are almost like these lenses. And as we look at a new situation or a problem, and we have this certain story or mental model of how to solve such problems, and we just keep using that same mental model or story over and over again, if we ask the question, well, what if I just experimented? What if I just decided to look at this same situation with a different story, with a different mental model? I'm not letting go of the one that I value, but I'm just going to look at it with a different one as well. And I begin to accept the idea that I'm holding on to what people would call the paradox moment. I have two stories that seem very different, and I'm going to be looking at this situation, and I'm going to try each of the stories. So you begin to notice two things that both can seem true to you. Now, I'm not arguing that there's no such thing as absolute truth. I'm actually an advocate for absolute truth. Many of you know that I come from a biblical Christian background in my beliefs, and I hold to them firmly and am unswerving on those, which is actually why I'm even more comfortable being very flexible in other domains, because I have these few areas that are admittedly stories that I will not touch or change, that are core and foundational to me. And everything else is on the table for me. So I'm willing to take some risks and to consider some different strategies and methods and stories. What if I could look at it from another angle? That's called reframing. And you're not rejecting your original explanation. You're just rotating the way that you're looking at it. Imagine there's a very large object and you've been looking at the object from one side, and you're looking at that one side of it, but you've never looked at what's on the back side of the object. It could look very different. There could be more to that object than what you see from your one position, or you look at it from the side. And so that is what can give you some new insight on situations. Think of it like tools that you're using to solve problems and make decisions and achieve goals. So as you do this, you do begin to notice something though. You may start to realize, as you're holding on to a couple of different approaches or methods and testing them out, is this decision made sense. This new story worked really well for me. Or you could see that it produced problems that you don't want to create. You could find out that it helped you quite a bit. Or you could realize that the story you'd been using before, the mental model, was actually limiting you in some ways that aren't very helpful. And it doesn't feel like an attack. By simply adding something else that you're willing to consider and try out, a new mental model, a new method. So maybe it's a method for solving a riddle or a clue that you run into, or even navigating some kind of common problem, even something with a bill that you have at home, and you have a certain approach when you have a challenge to a bill that you received and how you communicate with the person on the phone. You've had a certain story, a certain mental model for how to do that. And maybe you allow yourself to say, maybe there's a different way to approach this. Maybe I catch more flies with honey. And maybe you didn't think of it that way. Maybe you always put a moral frame on it and you just framed it immediately calling and said, this is morally wrong. What you're doing is wrong and you need to stop. And that strategy was not getting you the results that you wanted. And so you shift and you say, okay, I'm not denying the fact that I believe there's a moral issue here, that they're doing something immoral in the way that this company is acting or behaving, but I want a certain result here. I want my bill to be lower than it was before. And I'm not denying or changing the moral fact, but I'm going to act and speak and use a tool to try to get a different result. So I'm going to realize that the person I'm talking to does not set all the rules or the policies for the company. That person does not represent everything about the company. So I'm going to treat the person as a human being, and I'm going to talk to them that way. And I'm going to treat them with kindness and respect, even when I disagree, and I'm going to see what happens as a result. And maybe what we find is you don't get any better outcome than you did before, except that you feel a little bit better after you hang up the phone, and maybe your blood pressure isn't as high as it was before. But it could also be that you found an ally and someone that also didn't agree with all of the policies of the company, but they work for it and they don't have the ability to change it. But they do have some flexibility to help you out, and they do. So I'm talking about very practical things like this, but this applies in gameplay and other environments, which is why I am such a big advocate for gameplay, because it's a great place to experiment with different methods and mental models and tactics and strategies and see the benefits and the downsides of each, and to do it in a really low risk environment. So as you go through this whole process, it's also important to do this in a place of safety, because what I just described, where you are willing to put a couple of different mental models or stories alongside one another, rather than to attack your preferred one, then your defenses go up, or let someone else attack it. You're just going to add a second model, a second tool, and try it out. Just set the other tool aside for a second. You have to have a measure of safety in order for this to work. If it doesn't feel safe to sit with the tension of a couple of competing stories or mental models, that door is going to slam shut. And if being wrong feels like an attack on your identity, or if it feels like embarrassment, or it could even feel like failure, you will find your mind battling against that. Your mind will defend itself. You will probably not make the progress that you want. So learning requires one more thing. It requires what some people call psychological safety, to say, I don't have to protect this explanation. I can just improve it. I have this mental model or this strategy, and I can have a couple of mental models and strategies that I can test out. And maybe I can actually make the one that I like so much better in the process. So we have to get to a place where we are feeling safe and comfortable enough to try these things out. And then we get to the final step here, which is a resolution. Ideally, when you do this enough, you either have added a new mental model or tool or strategy to your toolbox, or you've gone through a process that has allowed you to safely revise your dominant mental model or strategy and to improve it. And as a result, you will be thinking better. You will be making decisions with greater wisdom. You'll be better at problem solving. And this is the iterative process that we go through to learn to think more clearly, to engage in discovering those literal and metaphorical treasures in our lives. So this is why play and games, as I've talked about in other videos, and low-threat environments matter so much. They give us rare permission to revise our thinking without punishment or fear. But the deeper skill is still learning how to do this anywhere, in decisions, in relationships, and leadership. And that's what Bull and Thread is all about.